Hi and welcome. Today I'd like to show you 4 different embroidery stitches that are used on the Blanket the Town design. They are chain stitch, stem stitch, French knots, and lazy daisy chains. These are stitches that are very common in embroidery and look great on knitting. I'll be adding the embroidery to a 24 stitch wide by 48 row swatch. Here it is completed. It's a bit hard to draw on your knitting, so I'll show you a couple of ways that you can design. The first way is to use scrap yarns and what's called a finishing needle and to draw in yarn on your knitting. If you don't like what you've stitched, you can just unthread the needle and unpick your stitches and then do it again. When tracing out the design, you can go through the strands of a ridge or you can split them if you feel like it. Here I'm splitting them. This block I'm working on was knitted by my mom a few years ago. She was knitting blocks for baby blankets and I was sewing or crocheting them together, and then we were giving them to a hospital neonatal unit. We never did decorate any blocks, but now that I'm working on this one and putting a bee on it, and my mom's name is Betty, so maybe this is in honor of her, I'm thinking it would be really cute to embroider the entire alphabet on different blocks and make a blanket out of those. So if I was going to do that, I would probably want to plan out the letters a little bit more in advance so that they're like the same height and the same width. And to do that, I could use graph paper. Not the knitting graph paper, which you would use for stockinette stitch, but just regular old graph paper with squares on it. So the reason we can use regular graph paper is that 1 stitch wide and 2 rows in height equals 1 cell or 1 box on the graph paper. The main reason I'm making this video is that I design many garter stitch based blankets. My latest design, Blanket the Town, has embroidery on some of the blocks. In case you're interested in looking at that design in more detail, I'll leave you a link in the description. Let's take a detour into a different topic while Margaret finishes up the design. To embroider on garter stitch, you're going to have to learn what is a ridge and what is a stitch, and to be able to identify those in knitting. So let's take a close look. Here's a ridge outlined in red. It's really a series of little shapes called smiley and frowny faces, and it's raised up and therefore more visible than the parts of the stitches that are in between the ridges. This piece is stretched out quite a bit to show the ridges and what I refer to as the valleys between ridges. Here's a stitch outlined in red. It's essentially a loop of thread where the head of the loop is at the top. Note that it's intertwined with the loop just below, which is the previous row of knitting, and with another loop above, which is the next row of knitting. The locations to insert the needle are indicated by red dots. A fill dot is where you start the stitch, inserting the needle from front to back. The needle comes back up at the unfilled circle. I've chosen to insert in the center of a stitch, just below the ridge. Choosing a consistent location will make my stitches all about the same length. This is a vertical stitch, inserting down through the stitch under a ridge and up through the stitch under the next ridge, making sure to stay in the same column of stitches. This is a horizontal stitch, inserting down through the stitch and up through the adjacent stitch. Here's a stitch that's on the diagonal. These are needed to change directions, such as on the curved areas of the B shape. Insert down through the stitch under a ridge and up through the adjacent stitch of the adjacent ridge. It looks like Margaret's finally done with the design and might be ready to start the embroidery. I want the outline of this letter to be kind of thick, so I'm going to use a chain stitch, which I know will do this well. This block is worked in medium weight yarn, so it would be best to use either a medium weight yarn or something slightly heavier for the embroidery. Start by locating where you want to begin and insert the needle back to front, leaving about 5 or 6 inches on the back of the work. When embroidering, we want to be working with a single strand of yarn, not a double strand. So the loose end should be shorter than the end that's attached to your work. Let's do the first stitch. Insert the needle down through the place where it came up and then up 1 stitch or ridge away, following the drawing. Guide the attached end of the yarn so it goes in a clockwise direction and underneath the needle tip. Then pull the needle through and adjust the loop that you made so it looks just right. It shouldn't be too large and it shouldn't be too tight. If it's too loose, it looks sloppy and snags on everything. And if it's too tight, it's going to draw in the garter stitch knitting and pucker it. Now repeat, following the tracing, by inserting the needle down where it just came out from the last stitch, and then up 1 stitch away, and wrapping the attached end of the yarn clockwise around and under the needle tip, and pulling the needle through, and adjusting your stitch length. As you go along, you'll need to unpick the yarn that you used for the drawing, making a note of the direction that it's going for your next stitch. After a few stitches, my yarn may start to look like it's curling up. To remove the twist, turn the work upside down, let go of the needle, and let the yarn just untwist on its own. Let's fast forward to the corner. Here's what the back looks like so far, with its small and hopefully neat stitches. I'm trimming away the scrap yarn that I used for sketching the drawing as I go, so that it won't be in my way. I'm now at the corner. I'm rotating the work 90 degrees, and I'm looking for the location where the yarn just came out. So I'm taking the next stitch as usual, except that I'm doing it at 90 degrees or perpendicular to the last stitch. And instead of going up 1 ridge, I'm going over 1 stitch. For the horizontal stitches, like this one, we go 2 strands over with each stitch. Adjusting the tension. There the yarn is getting very twisted, so I just lift up the work and let the needle and the yarn untwist on its own. Keep adjusting the tension, check the other stitches. Now it looks like I'm running short of yarn, so I'm going to insert the needle down through the last stitch where I came out to secure that last loop. And then on the back, I'll weave in a little bit to secure the stitches. Here I'm splitting the wrong side stitches that I made with the orange yarn. And this will secure the yarn without me having to make a big knot. I don't really like knots, so I prefer a nice secure weaving in approach to making knots on the work. I can weave in with a very short end yarn using the Susan Bates needle because the yarn just keeps swinging down to the other end of the needle, as you see. I'll thread up the needle again. I'm using about a yard or so of yarn. It's a bit long. You could work with a shorter end, but then you'd have more weaving in to do of yarn ends. Make sure that one of the ends is longer than the other because you only want to be sewing with one strand. So looking at the back, we'll insert the needle back to front where we last took a stitch down to lock that last loop, and then through the last loop that we made. Pull it all the way through, leaving about a 5 or 6 inch tail on the other side, on the wrong side. Adjust it. I'll just clamp it between my fingers to secure it while I take the first stitch. After that, it won't pull through. Now this stitch is going to be on the diagonal because this is the curved part of the bee. So I want to go over one column of stitches and then down one ridge. So over to the side, one column, and down one ridge. So I need to locate where that is. So I'm bringing up the needle in the middle of the stitch that's one column over and one ridge down, just like that, and adjusting the yarn length. Now these diagonal stitches, this is a longer distance to go. There's the hole that I'm going in. So this is a longer distance because it's on the diagonal, so I'm going to have to leave those stitches like a little bit longer. But if I took shorter stitches, my garter stitch knitting would tend to stretch out more. So I think it's better to take just one stitch. Pull the yarn through and adjust the tension so all the stitches look nice and even. There's my drawing line, kind of right in the middle of where I need to go next. Okay, so now we've jumped ahead to the very end of the bee. So this is the last stitch, and the last stitch is going to go right into the first stitch, right into that first stitch's loop. Pull through, and then go back down through the hole we just came out and pull the yarn all the way through to lock that last loop of the last stitch. And now we're done, and so we can turn this over and we can weave in the yarn end that we've got left into the back of the stitches, the chain stitches, splitting the strands, and then we can remove our drawing yarn, our scrap yarn, permanently. And this is what our piece looks after we've finished the embroidery. Let's add a little bit more embroidery to this block by adding some flowers using the Lazy Daisy chain stitch, or what's also called the detached chain stitch. I think I'll do it in this peach color. And I first tried this off camera with a single yarn strand like I did the chain stitch with, and I discovered that it didn't really look very full, and so I'm going to do it with a double strand. And I'm going to make 4 or 5 petals just at the top right corner of this block, starting on the wrong side at the center of where I want my flower to be. It's a lot like a chain stitch. You hold the yarn to the left, you insert your needle down where it came out, and then out where you want the end of the flower petal to be. Here it's maybe 1 or 2 stitches over and 1 or 2 ridges over, as opposed to what we did before, where we were just going 1 stitch or 1 ridge. So you pull the yarn through and then adjust the loops so how you like them. And you should leave it slightly loose so that it really looks like a petal with a curve, right? And then let's come up the next place where we want the next petal to be, near the center of the flower. Straighten things out a little bit on the back. Make sure we don't have like loose yarn ears back there. Okay, that's looks tidier. And now we're gonna insert back down through the hole we just came out of, holding the yarn with our left thumb over to the left so that it ends up under the needle, going clockwise around and under the needle. Pull to tighten until we like the way it looks. Now we've got 2 strands, so we have to adjust both of them because they might be slightly different lengths. So you can use our needle for that. And then back down through the hole that we just came out of. Pull the yarn through. And notice how that little stitch, that last little stitch that we made, holds the little loop of our daisy chain flower petal in place. So now we're coming up again near the center. Hold yarn to the left, back down through the hole we came out of, up a little distance away at the end of the petal, and then adjust the yarn loop. And then back down through the hole we came out of. So it looks like we're going to have room for maybe 5 petals here. Just going around. I didn't mark these. I'm just kind of winging it. It doesn't have to be a perfectly shaped flower, because, you know, not all flowers are perfectly shaped anyway. Now here I'm tending to split the stitches because I really don't want these petals to sink into the valleys between the ridges of garter stitch. So I'm using splitting the stitches on the garter stitch ridges so that things really sit at the top of the knitting above the garter stitch ridges rather than sinking down below where we're not going to see them. So here we're just finishing the last of the petals, starting to get our yarn twisted. So they're not perfectly arranged, but they kind of look like a flower. So we'll have to go onto the back. Here I'm splitting a stitch in order to do a bit of a tie off. So I split a stitch first, then I go through the loop I made, and then straighten things up and go through the last loop that I made. And again, that's still just your basic 3-stage tie off. And since this flower is not holding the block together, I'm just going to trim it and I'll weave it in later. Of course, it's always good to weave in as you go, because that way you don't have to fuss with keeping that yarn end from snarling with the rest of your embroidery work. So I want to make a center now using a technique called French knots. And this is worked with a single strand of yarn. Start again, front to back, making a stitch. And here's another little example of the tie on. Just take a couple stitches, through a stitch on the back, and then through one of those stitches. That makes a very secure little knot. Not going to come loose. And anyway, these flower parts are not holding the block together, so they don't have to be that firm in terms of tie-offs. If you lose one French knot, it's not going to be the end of the world. Okay, so we're going to hold the yarn with our left index finger and thumb and wrap it back to front 3 or 4 times. I'm doing it 4 times here. And then carefully tensioning that yarn with your left hand and using your right hand fingers as you need to go back down through the hole near where you came up, and then pull the yarn to tighten, and it makes that nice little knot. And let's do another one. Here again, I'm splitting the strands as I'm inserting because I want these features at the top. Wrap back to front 3 or 4 times and then back down near where the yarn came out. And then now let's make one more coming up in a slightly different strand. Splitting the strand, hold the yarn in your left hand, make those twists around the needle, and then back down. Some people will hold the yarn in their left hand, or they'll pinch the twists on the needle as they're pulling through. So now we've turned it over, and I'm going to tie off the yarn using a 3-stage tie off and cut it fairly short. Again, these are not holding the piece together. So there we have a little simple flower using lazy daisy chains and French knots. So let's add some leaves. This is yet another stitch that I want to show you. This one is called the stem stitch. So appropriately, we're going to use it on a stem. So it's worked in a single strand. And then where you want to start, come back to front with the needle, pull it through, leaving a few inches for weaving in later, and then insert the needle down about one stitch or one ridge away, and then bring the needle back up where the yarn it merged originally. Now go forward again, one ridge or stitch, insert the needle down, and then bring the needle back up at the end of the previous stitch that you made. Always hold the yarn. The yarn should always be held with your left thumb so that it stays to the left of the work. At the end of each stitch, adjust the tension. And here I'm making a curve. I am also splitting strands of yarn on the ridges of the garter stitch knitting because I want this feature to sit right on top at the surface. Again, I didn't sketch this out. I'm just kind of winging it here to make, something that looks like an organic or curvy stem. Stem stitch was the first type of embroidery stitch that my mom taught me when I was a kid. And it's very versatile and useful to know. So if you want to make a very sharp turn, make your stitches smaller. If you're on a straightaway, you can have longer stitches. You can see I didn't really quite go short enough with my stitch going around that sharp curve there, and there's a little kind of stitch hanging out. I should have probably made a smaller stitch there. Okay, that looks pretty good. So on the back, I now want to make some leaves for my stem. So I'm going to travel back to where I want the first leaf to be by inserting my yarn through the stitches on the wrong side to the point where I want my first leaf to be. And now I'm just going to make a daisy chain, lazy daisy petal, just like I did for the flower. Insert where I came out. On the back, I'll travel to the next place where I want my next leaf to be by inserting through the back of the stem stitches. And now I'll make another lazy daisy petal. I don't want this to look like a flower growing up. I want it to look more like a vine. So I'm making the leaves kind of going in different directions. So they suggest more of a vine rather than a flower growing vertically up. And I'll make another one here, a friend for this one. I'm always turning my work so that I can push my needle away from me. That's most comfortable for me. And again, I almost forgot to travel. Let's remember to do that. Sometimes I go all the way under the stitch and sometimes I split it as I'm traveling. It kind of depends on my mood. Either way is fine. And then down and up where I want the leaf to end. Get that yarn around clockwise and underneath the needle. And then insert where the yarn emerged. And I think I have enough yarn for one more petal. I kind of pulled it a little too tight there, but that's okay. I'm running out of yarn. Okay, so get that yarn, that what little bit is left there, around the needle, clockwise, adjust the length, and now we're done with that. Okay, so that's a little flower to brighten up our bee. And I think that's going to be good. So now we have learned all these different stitches. Here's one of the blocks in the Blanket the Town blanket where we've used some embroidery. There is chain stitching and French knots. Thank you so much for joining me for this video. Please remember to subscribe and to set your notifications bell so you don't miss anything. And also sign up for my email newsletter, which I send out only when I publish new patterns. It's at thenitwit.org/contact. Thank you, and see you next time. Happy knitting.